The morning of March 3rd, 1945, dawned pale and breathless over the western Pacific. The sea was a sheet of burnished metal stretching toward the horizon, and the sky above the carrier USS Lexington glowed with that brief, deceptive peace that always came before launch operations. Lieutenant Commander John read. Mallory stood at the edge of the flight deck, helmet tucked under one arm, scanning the lightening sky. His Hellcat crouched behind him like a living creature impatient to run. The armourers had just finished slamming the last belts of ammunition into the wing bays, 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each loaded with 400 rounds, 2,400 bullets in total. He knew, almost down to the second, how long that gave him in a sustained burst. About 12 seconds. 12 seconds of fire to decide the fate of an invasion fleet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mallory had flown 72 missions since 1943. He was no novice, but that morning a flicker of unease gnawed at him. Intelligence had been uncertain, the orders vague, reconnaissance and ground suppression, Peleliu sector. The Marines were advancing on the southern beaches, and resistance had proven fiercer than expected. Japanese aircraft operating from the northern islands were still striking supply lines. Fleet Command wanted updated photographs of the airfields near Babelthwap. It sounded routine on paper, yet Mallory had long learned that routine was Navy shorthand for, "We have no idea what you'll find." The Hellcat's radial engine roared to life, vibrating through the deck. He climbed into the cockpit, straps cinched tight across his chest. The smell of oil and high-octane fuel filled the air, mingled with salt and cordite. On the signal officer's gesture, he pushed the throttle forward. The massive Grumman leaped down the deck, and within seconds he was airborne, the carrier dwindling behind into a white scar of wake. The ocean below seemed motionless at altitude, deceptive in its calm. He joined 2 other reconnaissance flights briefly, before veering north toward his assigned grid. By 800 hours, the island chains of the Western Carolines lay beneath him, patches of green and coral amid endless blue. Clouds clung to the ridges, and the morning haze softened the outlines of everything. He flew at 8,000 feet, camera switches armed, maintaining steady course as the automatic reconnaissance camera behind the cockpit clicked rhythmically. Intelligence officers wanted overlapping frames of the runways, dispersal areas, and supply zones. He had done this 100 times. The pattern was mechanical: level flight, shutter rhythm, minor corrections. Then, almost casually, the illusion shattered. Through a break in the haze, Mallory glimpsed what looked at first like dark flecks on the coral rows upon rows of them. He squinted, leaned closer, and felt a jolt of disbelief run through him. Those were aircraft, dozens of them, their silhouettes unmistakable. Ashes-0 fighters and twin-engine Betty bombers parked wingtip to wingtip along the edge of a long coral strip. At least 50 planes visible, maybe more under camouflage netting at the tree line. He could see fuel drums stacked nearby, men moving between aircraft, the flash of sunlight on canopies. The field was alive with preparation. His first instinct was disbelief. The area had been declared inactive for weeks. Naval intelligence insisted the Japanese had withdrawn their air units to the Philippines after the Peleliu campaign bogged down. But below him, the evidence contradicted every report. Those planes were not derelict, they were being readied for flight. Even from altitude he could see propellers being turned by ground crew, engines coughing, to life. The Japanese were preparing something massive, a coordinated counterstrike, perhaps against the convoys bringing reinforcements ashore. He checked his watch. 825. If they launched within the hour, those aircraft could reach the beaches by 9, hitting the vulnerable landing craft and transports. The thought turned his stomach cold. He clicked the transmit key, hesitated, and then switched channels. The protocol was to radio back, report, and wait for orders. But he knew what that meant. At least 90 minutes before a strike package could arrive. 90 minutes while the Japanese dispersed, camouflaged, or worse, took off. He circled once more, descending to 3,000 feet. From here, the view was unmistakable. The runway stretched like a bleached scar across the jungle. Every revetment was full, every dispersal area crammed. Whoever commanded that base had committed a cardinal sin of aviation, warfare concentration. Planes parked close together, fuel stored beside them, ammunition dumps barely 100 yards away. It was an accident waiting for a spark. Mallory's mind began to race through calculations. He had 12 seconds of firing time. Each gun fired roughly 750 rounds per minute. If he could ignite the fuel stores or hit the parked aircraft nearest them, the fire might spread. The geometry of destruction favored him: tightly packed planes, gasoline, and ordnance all in one place. If he struck from the right angle, the Hellcat's 6 guns could light the entire field like a fuse. The risk, however, was nearly suicidal. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses. 25mm Type 986 guns ringed most operational airfields. Once he dropped below 1,000 feet, he would be within their kill zone. He knew the doctrine. Ground attack missions were meant to be coordinated, multiple fighters sweeping in together to saturate defenses. Alone, even a rugged Hellcat could be shredded by concentrated fire. But time was the one thing he didn't have. The fleet depended on surprise. If those planes lifted off, the invasion beaches would become killing grounds. He thought briefly of the men unloading supplies in the surf. Marines bent under crates, Navy coxswains steering landing craft through coral channels, the wounded being ferried back. They had no idea an airfield full of Japanese aircraft waited just beyond the horizon. His decision came not as impulse, but as grim arithmetic. The odds were impossible, but inaction guaranteed disaster. He trimmed the Hellcat, flipped the arming switches, and pushed the throttle forward. The big fighter shuddered as its supercharger bit the humid air. The altimeter needle dropped 2,000, 1,500, 1,000. He leveled off barely 200 feet above the waves, the coastline rushing toward him. The jungle blurred into a smear of green. Ahead, the white line of the rest. Runway widened rapidly. He could see men running now, figures scattering between aircraft. They must have spotted his silhouette emerging over the treetops. He lined up his sights on the first cluster of fuel drums beside a row of bombers, the bright metal shining like mirrors. The windscreen crosshair steadied. The target filled his vision. He squeezed the trigger. The Hellcat vibrated violently as all 6 guns erupted in unison, tracers streaming forward in molten ribbons. The first rounds struck the fuel drums, and an instant later a yellow-orange bloom erupted, fire climbing skyward. He banked slightly, raking the parked planes in sequence. Flames lapped from one to another, the shock waves punching through the thin aluminum fuselages. The field below dissolved into chaos. Ammunition cooked off in rapid bursts, and black smoke rolled across the coral. He pulled up slightly, the deck of the runway flashing beneath his wings. The anti-aircraft guns opened up staccato bursts, tracers stitching the air behind him. He felt the thuds of hits on the fuselage, small holes punching through the metal skin. The Hellcat's engine cooled but held steady. He swung wide over the lagoon, climbing just enough to circle back for another run. Mallory's breathing came in gasps now, sweat streaming down his face inside the helmet. He could smell the gunpowder and cordite filling the cockpit. The second pass would be the killer. The Japanese gunners would be ready. But he also saw something that urged him on secondary fires, spreading toward the ammunition dump at the far end of the field. If he could accelerate that, the entire base might go up. He dove again, hugging the tree line. The altimeter barely registered 100 feet. Palm fronds whipped in his slipstream. As he came over the field, tracers lanced up from at least 4 gun positions. One clipped the right wingtip, shearing a sliver of metal that spun away into the smoke. He held course, teeth clenched, aiming for the mound of ammunition crates half hidden beneath a tarpaulin. A moment later, a thunderous explosion ripped across the airfield as the dump detonated. The shockwave hit the Hellcat like a hammer, tossing it upward. He fought the controls, wings shuddering, smoke and debris engulfing the canopy. For a heartbeat he thought he had lost control, but the plane responded, limping through the turbulence. Behind him, the inferno spread unchecked. Ra's of fighters were engulfed, flames running down fuel lines like molten snakes. He banked out over the sea, glancing back. The entire northern half of the airstrip was burning, black columns of smoke rising thousands of feet. Through gaps in the haze, he saw silhouettes of men running, vehicles overturned, secondary explosions bursting one after another. The Japanese defense network had collapsed into confusion. He had achieved the impossible, crippled an entire airfield with 2 passes. He took inventory. Ammunition expended, half a fuel load remaining, engine temperature climbing but stable. He switched to auxiliary tank and began climbing, setting course south toward the fleet. His hands trembled on the throttle. The smell of smoke clung to him, a physical reminder of what he had just done. Below, the inferno consumed everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As he cleared the island's southern tip, the adrenaline drained away, leaving only a strange quiet. He replayed the last 12 minutes in fragments: the first spark, the lines of tracers, the blast that nearly flipped him. He knew the official report would never capture it. They would note, reconnaissance pilot engaged enemy, airfield, inflicted heavy damage, perhaps a few lines in a daily dispatch. No one would mention the moment he chose disobedience over procedure, or that the decision had likely saved the fleet. Back aboard the Lexington, the deck crew gathered as his battered Hellcat touched down. One wingtip was scorched, the fuselage peppered with holes, and smoke residue streaked the cowling. When he climbed down, his flight suit was soaked, his face blackened with soot. The deck officer stared, speechless, before barking for damage control to secure the aircraft. Mallory said little. He removed his helmet, handed it to the crew chief, and walked toward the ready room. Only then did the enormity of what he had done sink in. Within hours, reconnaissance photos confirmed the destruction. 50 aircraft destroyed on the ground, fuel and ammunition depots obliterated, the runway cratered and unusable. The Japanese air threat to the invasion beaches vanished overnight. Later described it as a field of blackened skeletons, twisted aluminum glinting in the sun. Fleet intelligence credited the attack with preventing a major counterstrike. Officially, it was labeled unplanned ground action by a reconnaissance flight, but among the men on the Lexington, the story spread quickly. They called it Mallory's 12-second miracle. He never claimed heroism. In his debrief, when asked why he hadn't radioed for support, he simply said, "There wasn't time." That phrase entered squadron folklore, repeated with equal parts admiration and disbelief. Behind it lay the unspoken truth known to every combat pilot that courage and recklessness were often separated by the thinnest margin, and survival depended on which side of that line chance allowed you to fall. Later that evening, as the sun set crimson over the Pacific, Mallory stood alone on the deck, watching the horizon. The air smelled of fuel and salt. In the distance, faint smudges of smoke still marked the island he had struck. He thought of the men on the ground, Japanese mechanics who had been doing their duty as surely as he had done his. War, he realized, turned every decision into a coin toss between necessity and conscience. 12 seconds of gunfire had changed the course of a battle and perhaps saved thousands, but the cost remained heavy, invisible, and permanent. He would fly again the next morning, another mission, another set of coordinates. The war machine never paused to celebrate individual defiance. Yet, in that brief moment between orders and action, between logic and instinct, John Mallory had embodied the paradox of air war in the Pacific, that survival often demanded a reckless courage the manuals could never teach. The following morning began not with fanfare, but with silence. The carrier's loudspeakers, which usually blared the dawn call, remained muted as the crew assembled for routine briefings. News of Mallory's solo attack had already rippled through the ship, carried by the unbroken chain of deck, gossip faster than any official communiqué. Pilots from other squadrons approached him with half-joking salutes, calling him the man who lit half of Babelthwup with a match. He answered only with a faint smile. Behind the humour, he sensed their unease. Every one of them knew that his decision had violated standing orders. Heroism and insubordination often shared the same shadow, and no one could yet tell which label command would choose. In the ready room, the atmosphere was tense. The air smelled of coffee and sweat, the walls plastered with maps and reconnaissance photographs. Commander Rhodes, the air group's operations officer, entered carrying a stack of fresh prints. Without preamble, he spread them on the table. Even across the room, Mallory could see the devastation. Black smudges where aircraft once stood, the runway split by gaping craters, fuel depots erased. The imagery analysts had circled. Damage points in red grease pencil, dozens of them. Rhodes looked up, his expression unreadable. These came from the morning recon run. "You did it, Red. The entire northern sector is gone." A murmur swept the room. One of the younger pilots let out a low whistle. Rhodes waited for the noise to subside. "Fleet intelligence confirms over 50 aircraft destroyed. They were preparing for a coordinated strike on our landing craft. If they'd launched, the casualty lists would have run for pages." He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. Then his tone hardened. "However, you acted without authorization, broke radio silence, and engaged ground targets while assigned to recon. Command wants a full explanation." Mallory nodded slowly. He had expected this. "There wasn't time," he said again, the same phrase from his debrief. Rhodes studied him for a moment, then exhaled through his nose. "Maybe not. Want procedure." The word hung in the air like a verdict. An hour later, he was summoned to the flag cabin. Rear Admiral Carmichael, commander of Task Force 58, sat behind a steel desk, his cap resting beside a stack of reports. The Admiral's face was lined, the eyes tired but sharp. He motioned for Mallory to sit. For a long moment he said nothing, studying the younger man. Then, in a voice calm but edged with curiosity, he began, "Lieutenant Commander, you realize that by attacking without clearance, you assumed full operational risk. If you'd been shot down, we'd have had no idea what happened." "Yes, sir," Mallory replied quietly. "But if I hadn't acted, they would have launched within the hour. We had no bombers close enough to strike. The fleet would have taken the hit blind." Carmichael tapped a pencil against the desk. "You're aware of doctrine. Reconnaissance flights are to observe, report, and withdraw. You turned that into an offensive action. That's not doctrine, that's improvisation." He leaned back. Yet he gestured toward the photo spread on the table. Sometimes improvisation wins wars. The Admiral rose, walked to the porthole, and stared at the sea. "Do you know how many men those planes would have killed, Commander?" "I don't. Neither do you. But we both know the number would have been high. You may have saved a division this morning." He turned back, his expression softening. "That doesn't absolve you, but it complicates things. History has a way of forgiving the reckless when the results look heroic." Mallory left the meeting unsure whether he'd been praised or reprimanded. His flight log for that mission was sealed, and the official communiqué reduced his feat to a 3-line entry. Yet among the carrier's pilots, his reputation took on a life of its own. They began calling him 12-Second Red, a nickname that spread to other ships. Pilots he'd never met stopped him in passageways to shake his hand. In the wardroom, stories grew by the hour. 50 planes became 60, 2 passes became 5, and by week's end, someone swore he'd strafed the field with both wings on fire. He never corrected them. Myths served a purpose in wartime, they filled the spaces facts couldn't reach. 2 days later, intelligence officers arrived aboard from the flagship Enterprise to conduct interviews. One of them, Lieutenant Abrams, carried a clipboard stacked with typewritten notes. "We're trying to reconstruct the sequence," he said, as they sat in the briefing room. Command wants to understand why the enemy concentrated aircraft in that sector after months of dispersal. Your photographs and gun camera footage might hold clues. Mallory raised an eyebrow. Gun camera? That got blown off on the first pass. Abrams smiled faintly. Then your memory will have to do. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Mallory described the layout of the airfield, position of the fuel drums, the timing between passes. Abrams scribbled furiously. At the end, he asked quietly, do you realize you may have forced a tactical shift in Japanese air deployment? Our intercepts show they're now relocating what's left of their planes deeper inland. They're terrified of low-level surprise strikes. That evening, alone in his bunk, Mallory stared at the ceiling fans spinning lazily above. The hum reminded him of propeller blades, and for a moment the memory of fire returned, so vividly he could smell it. He saw again the figures running across the coral, the moment the ammunition dump went up, the instant of weightlessness as the blast caught his aircraft. In the afterglow of victory, guilt arrived quietly, uninvited. The men on the ground had no chance. They hadn't seen his face, hadn't known his name. War reduced everything to silhouettes and crosshairs. 3 days later, the task force shifted operations northward. The battle for Luzon was nearing its end, and preparations for Okinawa were underway. Mallory's squadron was assigned escort duty for bomber raids against Formosa. On paper, his record remained flawless. Unofficially, his commanding officer kept him under watch. You've used up your luck, Rhodes told him. Don't go trying to repeat miracles. Mallory nodded, though part of him knew that was impossible. Once a man defied odds and lived, he carried that defiance like a contagion. On March 10th, during a raid escort, the Hellcats encountered heavy flak over Kaohsiung. One of the bombers was hit, its right engine trailing smoke. Mallory dove instinctively, covering the wounded aircraft until it reached open sea. When they landed back on the Lexington, the crew counted 23 holes in his wings. Reckless again, Rhodes muttered, but there was no anger left in the words, only resignation. The line between bravery and obsession had thinned. Weeks passed, and the Pacific War ground toward its climax. Okinawa turned into a bloodbath. Kamikaze attacks came in waves, and every pilot aboard knew the odds were tightening. During brief lulls, the men replayed their own near-deaths like talismans, as though reciting them aloud might buy more time. Mallory rarely joined. His mind kept circling back to that coral runway and the inferno he'd left behind. It had granted him fame, yes, but also a private reckoning. He had seen what a few seconds of gunfire could unleash, and the memory weighed heavier than medals. By late April, Fleet Intelligence requested a tactical assessment from him, an informal consultation on low-level attack feasibility. He met with analysts in a cramped cabin filled with cigarette smoke. Charts covered every wall. Altitudes, approach angles, weapon dispersion patterns. Your run demonstrated the lethality of close-range strafing against clustered assets, one officer said. We're considering incorporating it into new carrier doctrine. The British have begun similar experiments. Mallory frowned. With proper coordination, sure. But alone? My luck held once, it won't again. The officers nodded but took notes anyway. Doctrine always followed victory, not caution. In May, word came that Admiral Nimitz himself had reviewed after-action reports mentioning Mallory's strike. The message arrived through coded dispatch, phrased in bureaucratic understatement. Commendation under consideration, pending verification of results. Nothing came of it immediately. The Navy moved too fast for paperwork to catch up. But among pilots, his story became shorthand for defiance, the lone flyer who turned reconnaissance into annihilation. As summer approached, the war's tempo intensified. Kamikaze sorties increased, night attacks multiplied, and the carriers rarely slept. On one humid evening, after returning from a dusk patrol, Mallory found himself standing on the deck again, watching tracer fire arc across the horizon from distant ships. A young ensign approached, barely 20, eyes wide with hero worship. "Sir, is it true you hit 50 planes in one go?" Mallory hesitated, then said softly, "Something like that." The boy grinned. "Someday I want to do what you did." Mallory looked back toward the dark horizon. "No," he said after a pause. "You want to survive it." The night swallowed his words, but the truth lingered. The older he grew in combat hours, the clearer he saw the pattern. Every victory carried an unseen debt, and the collection came due eventually. Pilots disappeared, not dramatically but routinely, erased by mechanical failure or a lucky burst of flak. Heroism, he realized, was just endurance wearing a thin disguise. When Japan finally surrendered in August, the Lexington anchored off Okinawa amid a ghost fleet of battered carriers and destroyers. The crew erupted in celebration, but Mallory felt only exhaustion. His Hellcat, patched and scarred, sat chained on deck under the tropical rain. It had survived 26 more sorties since the fateful March morning. He ran a hand along its cowling, the metal warm from the day's heat. The aircraft had become both weapon and witness. The post-war months blurred. He was transferred to Pearl Harbor for debrief and reassignment. Historians later traced fragments of his report pages, noting the effectiveness of low-level strafing, recommendations for future tactical development, and a final handwritten line: "Success owed more to timing than bravery." Official commendations arrived eventually, though modest, a Navy Cross citation for "extraordinary heroism in action against the enemy." He accepted it without ceremony, placing the medal in a drawer. Years later, long after demobilization, Mallory returned to the sea as a civilian pilot, flying mail routes across the Pacific. The ocean looked the same, endless, indifferent, but the silence above it felt heavier. Sometimes, when clouds broke just right and the light struck the waves in a familiar way, he would see again the flash of that burning airfield. He never spoke of it publicly, though younger pilots occasionally sought him out, eager to hear the story. He always told it simply, that war rewards the man who acts when others hesitate, but it never lets him rest afterward. Historians reconstructed his mission decades later from declassified records and scattered eyewitness accounts. They debated the accuracy of the numbers. Some argued 48 planes destroyed, others 53, but all agreed on the essentials. A lone Hellcat pilot, 12 minutes of combat, an airfield erased. Analysts noted how his action anticipated later doctrines of rapid ground suppression and interdiction. Modern military academies studied it as an example of initiative, under uncertainty. Yet those who read his personal letters found a different tone, one of humility bordering on remorse. In one, dated 1952, he wrote, "They called it reckless, then brave. I suppose it was both. But bravery is just fear carried one step further." In his later years, Mallory lived quietly in California, tending a small coastal airstrip. Visitors sometimes noticed an old propeller mounted on the hangar wall, its blades scorched and pitted. Few recognized it as part of a wartime Hellcat. To those who asked, he would only say, "It reminds me how thin the line is between courage and madness." When he died in 1971, the Navy sent a simple wreath. His ashes were scattered over the Pacific, near the same waters where he'd once taken off into the morning haze. Decades after his death, when digital archives began to catalogue oral histories, his name resurfaced. A surviving crewmate from the Lexington described that day in March, with awe still audible in his voice. He didn't think he was saving anyone. He just saw a job that needed doing and no time to ask permission. The recording captured a truth the documents missed that in war. History's grand arcs often hinge on the choices of men who act alone, guided by instinct more than command. For historians, Mallory's 12-minute strike remains a paradox, a perfect synthesis of tactical genius and pure recklessness. It demonstrated the devastating potential of low-level aggression, but also highlighted the unbearable risk it demanded. In modern doctrine, such solo action would be unthinkable. Drones and satellites now deliver precision without exposing a single pilot. Yet, In that final spring of the Pacific War, when the world balanced between chaos and victory, one man's defiance altered the rhythm of an entire campaign. His Hellcat's guns spoke for only 12 seconds, but the echo carried across generations. And somewhere, perhaps in the stillness before dawn over an empty ocean, the sound of that engine still lingers, a faint reminder that sometimes the reckless are the ones who win the peace. The ocean before dawn was a living thing, dark, slow-breathing, endless. A single carrier rode its surface, engines rumbling like a heartbeat beneath steel. In that suspended hour before sunrise, the deck crew moved through shadows, faces pale in the floodlights. They worked in silence, securing lines, checking guns, loading belts of .50 caliber ammunition. The air smelled of salt and oil, and something electric. The tension of men about to risk everything. Then came the low growl of radial engines warming up, and the spell broke. The day's war was about to begin. From a distance, you might have mistaken the lead pilot for any other man in flight gear. But those who served with him remembered the details, the way Lieutenant Commander John Red Mallory adjusted his gloves twice before every launch, the small habit of tapping the fuselage as if saying, "Bring me home again." He was 30 years old, a veteran of 72 sorties, and already carried the look of someone older than his own reflection. That morning, March 3rd, 1945, he was scheduled for a reconnaissance run north of Peleliu. Routine, unremarkable, another day of war. At least that's what the briefing said. The carrier's signal officer gave the wave, and Mallory's Hellcat surged forward, tail lifting, propeller cutting the dawn. The aircraft leaped free of the deck and climbed into pale light, the sea falling away below. Within seconds, the carrier shrank to a toy against the horizon. Mallory leveled off at 8,000 feet, the Pacific stretching to infinity. In his headset, nothing but the quiet hum of radio static. For a few precious minutes, there was peace the kind pilots learned to measure not in hours but in heartbeats. He flew north, checking gauges, scanning the horizon for weather. Clouds hung low and still, and the world felt suspended between sleep and awakening. Then the island chain appeared, fragments of green on a blue-black field. Mallory trimmed the plane, set his camera switches, and began the methodical sweep of the assigned sector. Each click of the camera was mechanical, detached until the pattern broke. Through a gap in the haze, he saw movement. At first, only shapes, dark ovals scattered along a strip of coral, but as he descended for a clearer look, those shapes resolved into something unmistakable. Airplanes. Dozens of them. Zero fighters, twin-engine Betty bombers, all lined wingtip to wingtip as if someone had drawn them there. Smoke drifted from a few as engines warmed. Fuel drums glittered in sunlight. Ground crews moved briskly, unaware that from above, one man was watching their entire operation through the crosshairs of history. He should have turned away. Doctrine demanded it observe, report, and withdraw. But his instinct screamed something else. Intelligence had marked this field as inactive, yet below he counted at least 50 operational aircraft ready to fly. The implications hit instantly. Within an hour, those planes could be airborne, striking the vulnerable convoys near Peleliu. The invasion beaches would become firestorms. Thousands of men, marines, sailors, transport crews, were minutes from catastrophe they couldn't see coming. He looked again, calculating distances, fuel, ammunition. 12 seconds of firing time, that was all his 6 guns allowed. 12 seconds to change the course of a battle. The decision didn't come with a speech or drum roll. It came like a reflex, born from exhaustion and duty. He pushed the throttle forward. The Hellcat roared, nose dipping toward the sea. Altimeter unwound 3,000. 2. 1. He skimmed the water at 200 feet, the coastline rushing up like a blade. Palm trees whipped past in a blur. Ahead, the runway widened, pale against the jungle. Men on the ground looked up, mouths open. By the time they moved, it was too late. The first burst was pure instinct. The guns hammered, tracers lancing forward in molten lines. They struck the fuel drums, and the world erupted. Fire blossomed outward, yellow and white and violent. Mallory pulled through the smoke, rolling slightly to rake the parked planes. Aluminum split like paper. Explosions walked down the line. The field became a storm of debris and flame. Behind him, anti-aircraft guns opened up, red tracers clawing the sky. The Hellcat shuddered under hits. He felt the impact through the seat, the metallic cough of a wounded engine, but he stayed level. One pass wasn't enough. Not yet. He climbed barely 500 feet, looped wide over the lagoon, and came back. Smoke boiled across the runway. Through gaps, he saw ammunition dumps stacked in neat rows, a perfect target. Every instinct told him to climb, to live, to get home. Instead, he dove again, lower than before, skimming treetops. Tracers tore past the canopy, bright lines of death. He ignored them, lined up the tarpaulin-covered mound, and squeezed the trigger. The guns answered with a single, thunderous note. A heartbeat later, the ground exploded. The blast lifted a bomber off its wheels. A wall of flame chased him skyward, slamming the plane upward like a toy. For a moment the cockpit filled with smoke and light. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see, but the engine held, coughing, trembling, alive. He climbed through black clouds, levelled off, and saw what he had done. The airfield was gone. Fire rolled from one end to the other, consuming everything. Black pillars twisted toward the sky. Through them, the silhouettes of aircraft melted, wings folding, tails collapsing. He circled once, avid and horrified. The Japanese gunners had stopped firing. There was nothing left to defend. He banked south, flying low over the sea, adrenaline burning through him. In 12 minutes, the impossible had happened. 50 aircraft destroyed, 2 fuel depots. Annihilated, 1 pilot still breathing. Back aboard the carrier, silence met him. The deck crew stared as the scarred Hellcat rolled to a stop, metal pitted, wings scorched. When he climbed out, his face was black with soot, his eyes bright with something between disbelief and fatigue. Someone clapped, others followed. He didn't smile. The cheering sounded distant, hollow. All he wanted was water, and sleep, and silence. Officially, the mission became unplanned ground action by reconnaissance pilot. Unofficially, it was legend. The next morning, reconnaissance photos confirmed total destruction. Intelligence officers struggled to explain why so many enemy planes had been caught unguarded. Some called it luck, others divine intervention. Mallory said nothing. He knew the truth. It had been calculation, desperation, and 12 seconds of fire that could never be repeated. When the Admiral called him in for questioning, the exchange was short. Why did you attack without orders? There wasn't time. The answer became his epitaph long before his death. The Admiral studied him for a long moment, then simply said, "Let's hope history agrees with you." It did, but victory carried its own weight. In the nights that followed, Mallory woke drenched in sweat, the smell of burning fuel still in his lungs. He replayed the attack again and again, the men running, the fire spreading, the blast that almost tore his wings off. He reminded himself they were enemy soldiers, mechanics serving their emperor. Still, the images stayed. War never asked permission before haunting you. Months later, the war edged toward its bloody finale at Okinawa. The Japanese air threat had been crippled, thanks in part to strikes like his, yet the skies remained deadly. Kamikazes came by the hundreds. Mallory flew escort missions, watching friends vanish in flashes of flame. Each loss reminded him how thin the line was between legend and statistics. He stopped keeping count. After the surrender, the Navy filed his report among thousands of others. A citation followed a Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism, but he barely glanced at it. The real reward was survival, though even that felt temporary. When peace finally arrived, it was too quiet. He had lived for the roar of engines, the smell of oil, the certainty of purpose. Now the silence pressed in like a second ocean. Years passed. The world moved on, inventing new wars, new machines. Mallory faded into civilian life, a crop duster first, then a flight instructor on the California coast. Students whispered stories about him, how he'd destroyed 50 planes alone, how he'd flown through fire and come out whole. He never corrected them. The truth was simpler and heavier. He had done what the moment demanded, nothing more. Sometimes, on clear mornings, he would roll an old biplane out of the hangar and fly low over the Pacific. The sound of the engine carried him back. He would look down at the waves and imagine that coral runway buried under years of tide and silence. Beneath those waters lay the ghosts of men who'd once stared up at a descending Hellcat. He wondered if, in their final seconds, they'd understood that the man attacking them hadn't hated them. He'd simply run out of time. Historians later pieced his story together from declassified reports, combat logs, and interviews. They argued over the numbers 48 destroyed, 52, no one certain. But every account agreed on one point: his strike changed Pacific air doctrine. It proved that low-level aggression could cripple concentrated forces faster than any bombing raid. In a single reckless act, Mallory had rewritten the margins of aerial warfare. Yet the legend obscured the man. In his private letters, discovered after his death, he wrote of fear more often than courage. "They call it daring," one line read, "but I remember shaking so badly I nearly dropped the stick." Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do in the middle of it. Another entry, dated years later: "I still see the fire when I close my eyes. We won, but I'm not sure we were the lucky ones." Those words never reached the history books. They belonged to the quiet side of victory, the one that lives after the medals tarnish. In old age, he kept a single relic from the war, a propeller blade burned at the edges, mounted on his hangar wall. Visitors sometimes asked where it came from. He'd just smile and say, "From a day I learned what 12 seconds can do." That was all. The rest remained in the unspoken places between memory and confession. When he died in 1971, the Navy sent a wreath and a letter of gratitude. His ashes were scattered over the Pacific, the same waters where the story had begun. On calm mornings, pilots flying over those coordinates say the sea looks different still, glassy, as if remembering something too, fierce to forget. The tale of Lieutenant Commander Mallory survives in archives, documentaries, and the quiet awe of those who study the Pacific Air War. But to understand it fully, you have to stand on that carrier deck in imagination, feel the vibration under your boots, hear the rising growl of engines, smell the fuel thick in the air. You have to picture one man glancing toward a horizon filled with smoke and uncertainty and deciding, against every order, to dive. Not because he wanted glory, because he couldn't bear to watch men die while he did nothing. That's the paradox of heroes. They rarely recognize themselves as such. History crowns them afterward, long after they've paid the price. For Mallory, the price was 12 minutes of combat and a lifetime of remembering it. For the men on the beaches, it was survival bought by someone they would never meet. Somewhere, deep in the archives of naval history, there's a faded report labeled Reconnaissance Babelthwap, Sector. Beneath it, in neat typewriter font, a single line reads, "Enemy airfield destroyed by low-level attack. Pilot returned safely." No mention of the smoke, the fire, the trembling hands. Just that one sterile sentence standing where chaos once lived. And yet behind those words lies everything: the courage, the doubt, the reckless necessity of a man who had 12 seconds to choose between orders and action. Today, when the world speaks of precision strikes and unmanned drones, it's easy to forget there was once a time when every decision hung on flesh and instinct, when the difference between victory and disaster fit inside the space of a heartbeat. Mallory's run belongs to that vanished age, when men flee low enough to see the faces of those they fought, and war was measured not in data, but in the thunder of wings and the smell of burning fuel. And if you listen closely to the old recordings, to the wind over an empty airfield, you can almost hear it still. The roar of a Hellcat tearing across the Pacific sky, guns blazing, chasing time itself. The echo fades quickly, as all echoes do, but its meaning lingers. 12 seconds of courage, 12 minutes of chaos, one man's defiance written across the smoke of history. That's all war ever, is moments that refuse to vanish, and the stories we tell so they never will. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.